All right, welcome back. Congratulations, this is our last video for today. So the last thing I want to talk to you about is a kind of weird conclusion that we can draw from decomposing income and substitution effects, which is that in certain circumstances, we can end up with demand curves that slope upwards instead of sloping downwards. So what that means is, right, given the right circumstances, a decrease in price results in a decrease in quantity demanded rather than an increase, right? And of course, conversely, an increase in price would result in an increase in quantity demanded, right? Upward sloping demand curves. So let's think about how this could happen, thinking about income and substitution effects. So first of all, if we think about the substitution effect, right? If I decrease the price of a good, I'm decreasing its relative price, I have to have a positive substitution effect, right? So the substitution effect is always going to be a decrease in price results in an increase in quantity. It has to be. So in order to have a good with an upward sloping demand curve, that means that I have to have an income effect that results in a decrease in quantity. Right? So let's think about this. Our income effect from a price decrease, right? So I'm focusing on the price decrease case here. So if price decreases, we must get richer. So in order to have a negative income effect, when we get richer, we have to have a good that is inferior. Right? Ideally, a strongly inferior good, right? A good where the amount that we want to buy decreases a lot when we get richer. So what we're going to need here, right? We're going to need a small substitution effect overwhelmed by a large and negative income effect as a result of an inferior good. And as we've talked about, right, in order to have a big income effect, we're going to want that inferior good to make up a large portion of our overall budget. Now, this ends up being the case for a really important set of goods, which we'll call staple grains. And the idea here is, basically since the invention of agriculture, every region of the world has had one crop that is cheaper and easier to grow than anything else, and ends up making up the majority of the diet for the area's poorest people. So this was true of almost everyone in the world, from the start of agriculture to about the Industrial Revolution, that most of your diet comes from one particular food. Now it's still true only for the world's very poorest people, right? So that crop depends on where in the world you are, right? In Mexico, right, or Mesoamerica prior to colonization, and actually fairly recently it was corn, right? In a lot of northern Eurasia, it's wheat. In a lot of Asia, it's rice. In a lot of Africa, in West Africa, it might be cassava. In Eastern Africa, and these days, it's more likely to be corn. Right, we're going to have one good that makes up a large portion of your purchases. And one of the consequences of getting most of your calories from a single type of food, right, from a single grain, is that you might have enough calories to live, but you're going to get pretty severe nutrient deficiencies as a result of that. And of course, you're going to be pretty sick of eating that one food all of the time. So your staple grain is going to end up making up a large part of your budget and being a strongly inferior good. In fact, just speaking about nutrient deficiencies, if we look at the average height of human beings over time, we've only now reached the average height that humans had prior to the discovery of agriculture. And the reason is the development of agriculture meant that we could feed a lot more humans, population exploded, but all of those humans were a lot less healthy. So if we think about what this looks like, right, let's say, so someone did an experiment trying to look at this in the Hunan province in China, where the staple grain is rice. So let's imagine that we have rice and we have other food, right? We have an original budget where rice is fairly expensive, and especially for the poorest people, right? It makes up a large portion of our overall consumption, right? So we're going to consume a lot of rice, not a lot else. Then we want to think about what's going to happen when we decrease the price of rice. So we might expect, right, our indifference curve is going to be pretty curvy because, you know, we're eating rice to survive, but we'd really like to have a more varied diet in order to have better nutrition, right? So when we take our substitution effect, it might be fairly modest. Right, rice got relatively cheaper. We're going to buy a little bit more rice because rice got relatively cheaper, right? But not that much more, because we really want to have all of the complex nutrients that come from these other foods. So then we're going to have a pretty big change in income, right? And if rice is an inferior good, that big change in income is going to lead us to consume less rice and more of other goods. So we might end up with a final point where we actually consume less rice than we did initially, right? And the reason being that our income effect, S to F, is larger than substitution effect, right? O to S. So as I mentioned, right, a group of researchers tried to test this in the Hunan province in China by essentially offering the poorest people in the Hunan province, poor urban people, an opportunity to buy rice at a heavily subsidized price. So they essentially artificially reduced the price of rice. And then they tracked how much rice those people bought and how much of other goods they bought. And they found that exactly this happens, that particularly for very poor but not extremely poor people, rice consumption fell both as a portion of your total calories, but also in terms of absolute levels of consumption. So they found this Giffen good behavior. Another example where this is potentially an important real world phenomenon is in the Irish potato famine. So you might know, in the late 1800s, there was a potato blight that wiped out a lot of Ireland's potato crop, and the poorest people in Ireland used potatoes as a staple grain, right, as a staple crop. And one of the consequences of this that people talked about, we don't have very strong evidence of this, is that consumption of potatoes by the poorest people in Ireland might have actually increased. And the reason is this same logic, right? You go from F to O, essentially. You go from having potatoes be fairly cheap to potatoes being very expensive. People's response might be to prioritize getting enough calories by drastically cutting their consumption of other food, trying to increase their consumption of potatoes at the same time that the total number of potatoes available fell. And so this might explain why, according to observers at the time, all throughout the Irish potato famine, exports of food other than potatoes actually increased in Ireland, even as people were starving to death. And the reason might be essentially this, right, that the poorest people in Ireland shift their budgets to consuming only potatoes. Okay, so this is a really, really depressing use of income and substitution effects. I'm going to take a moment now to go back to the slightly less depressing use of income and substitution effects, which is trying to understand what drives a decrease in work when people get access to disability insurance. So this economist, Dave Otter, wanted to understand this, right? Wanted to know, are people reducing their work hours because they have a substitution effect, right? Because they're losing their incentive to work as a result of the program taking away your benefits if you increase your earnings? Or are they not working because they're sick and unhealthy and they have an income effect, right? Being able to get some sort of support from the government means that people are no longer required to force themselves to work when it's very, very painful or very damaging to their health to do so. So the way he did this was he looked at another disability program just for veterans called Veteran Disability Insurance that doesn't have any work requirements. Essentially, if you're eligible for veteran, if you can show that you were injured in work, you get disability payments regardless of how much money you make. And he showed that people on veterans disability insurance had about 2/3 the work reduction when they get on the program as do people on standard disability insurance. So from that, he argued that about 2/3 of this reduction in work hours is actually a result of an income effect rather than a substitution effect. And is evidence of the program working well rather than the program creating perverse incentives. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with that today. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I really look forward to talking to you all about this in person.